Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by a brand new guest, Mike Vlastnik, and we are talking all about the 2004 movie, Secret Window. Mike, for the listeners, can you give a quick intro?
I'm a podcaster and editor and writer, kind of not really doing a whole lot at the moment, but you can find me popping up on ghastlygrinning.com, just doing like horror movie reviews and editorials, or on the Phenomenal Flicks podcast on Spotify. I've been a semi-regular guest lately, but kind of just on the less impressive guest list for Chat Cemetery right now.
Everyone is an impressive guest on this podcast because it means you like Stephen King, and that takes a special kind of person.
Well, thank you.
And today, like I said, we're talking about Secret Window, which happens to be one of my most watched Stephen King adaptations. And I think the reason is because my parents own the DVD. And I actually ended up with a second copy of it because it ended up being in some sort of like box set kind of thing that I bought down the line because I needed the other movies in the set. And I had seen it. I don't know if they realized it was a Stephen King adaptation when it came out, because there are people out there who don't know that like Shawshank and The Green Mile are Stephen King stories. So it's very easy for me to believe that they probably just bought this because of who was in it. But for you, Mike, what has your experience been like with this movie before we dive into cast and story?
I definitely saw this movie in theaters when it came out, senior year of high school for me, I believe. I definitely was attracted to it because it was a Stephen King adaptation, being a huge King fan from probably way too early in my life. And then the added bonus of like Johnny Depp was in it and Pirates of the Caribbean had just come out. So like I feel like I remember this movie being a much bigger deal than it actually was. And then I definitely bought it on DVD as soon as it came out. And it's probably one of the Stephen King adaptations I've seen the most. And, you know, I own it now, so it was really easy for me to go and rewatch it again. And I watch it, you know, it's not like an every year rewatch for me, but fairly regularly.
Yeah, I probably watched it with my parents at some point, and then I had rewatched it when I wrote about it for Substream Magazine during one of their 31 Days of Halloween things that they do in October. But I think what's interesting with this one is, like you said, Johnny Depp is the star of it. And I know that he has his whole legal battle going on with Amber Heard right now. And that whole thing is very ugly in the scheme of crazy Hollywood things happening, to say the least. But
Yeah.
it's also got John Turturro, Maria Bello, Timothy Hutton, Charles S. Dutton, and I'm going to butcher his last name, but I think it's just Len Carew. I'm not 100% sure, but he's not in it a whole lot, so we don't have to focus too much on him. But have you seen The Dark Half by any chance, Mike?
I'm convinced that I have because my mom was a huge Stephen King fan. I don't remember it. I know that Timothy Hutton was in it, which is
Yeah.
a cool crossover, but like I don't have any vivid memory of watching it.
Okay. I wanted to ask because it's always interesting to me who ends up returning to Stephen King adaptations because it's happened so often, and I always forget that Timothy Hutton's in this movie somehow. I was just like, oh, okay, he's in this. And then you also have Maria Bello, who returns after this for the TV movie Big Driver.
Yeah, I always forget Timothy Hutton's in this too. I always think it's Tim Robbins when I watch the movie for some reason, and I don't know why. So, I mean, it is, like you said, it's cool, and you've called it out a bunch. You know, I have to assume that actors like doing Stephen King stuff if they like Stephen King, and that's why they keep doing these movies in the way that like Mick Garris kept doing Stephen King adaptations. So
I'm not sure Mick Garris will ever be done doing Stephen King adaptations.
no, hopefully not.
But for the mid 2000s, this is a fairly big cast. You have a lot of people who have won awards for acting, and John Turturro is always great. So to have him playing Shooter, it was just something that felt like it fit so well, and every person played their part exactly as you were hoping for. And I wouldn't say this is one of my favorite King adaptations, but it's a perfectly fine one. It's a good adaptation given the story. I think it depicts things like his split personality in a way that doesn't make it offensive.
This is one of my favorite King adaptations, but I think it is because, like you said, everybody plays the parts how you would expect them to. So, like when I'm reading, the novella and then watching this, Depp and Totoro both are like exactly how I picture those two characters. Really, I think the movie succeeds a lot just on their performances and their chemistry with each other.
Had you read the short story before going to the theater to watch this, or was it something where you were like, hey, it's Johnny Depp, he did the Pirates movies, it's Stephen King, I'm going to go watch this? Or were you able to get your hands on a copy of the story beforehand?
I had definitely read it at some point,
Okay.
but by the time that it came around to the movie, it wasn't oh, I remember that story, I need to go see the adaptation of it. It was, hey, here's a new Stephen King movie that Johnny Depp is in, I need to see that.
Yeah, I didn't read the short story until I started doing this podcast a couple years ago. So, whatever book that was in, I don't remember at this point because he has so many different collections. But it was a story that when I read it, I was then reading it in like Johnny Depp and John Turturro's voices,
Right.
which always makes for an interesting experience because the same exact thing happened to me when I watched Fight Club the movie before I read Fight Club the book. Everything I was reading was just in Edward Norton and Brad Pitt's voices in my head. And it's definitely weird when you do things backwards, especially as someone who enjoys reading the books before watching adaptations of things. Like, for instance, well, probably by the time this is out, The Haunting of Bly Manor will already be out, but I'm trying to get it to where I can read The Turn of the Screw before that comes out because I'm just like, I want to know the story before I go and spend a weekend watching that.
Yeah, I'm doing the exact same thing with Lovecraft Country right now. Like I'm trying to just plow through the book before I get to the miniseries because I want to have those two separate experiences. And I started to go back and I was reading the novella in preparation of rewatching the movie for this podcast. And then I stopped like halfway through and I was like, nope, I just want to focus on the movie here because it kept just being, it was just Johnny Depp and John Turturro in my head while I was reading the story.
Which is in Four Past Midnight. Found that information. So that was one of the novellas in that collection. And I think this story is just a very interesting look at mental health in general because it's about a writer, which is very typical of a Stephen King story. He loves putting writers in his story, and a lot of times people will say, write what you know. And it doesn't have to be exactly what you know, it's just add in these realistic elements that you can personally relate to, and then take that kind of story and make it extraordinary. And I think with this, it's not that it's an extraordinary story, but it's that he is able to depict this split personality in his character. And even if he himself does not have that, it's clear that he's either read up enough on it or asked a doctor friend or something like that. I know when people read On Writing and some of King's other nonfiction books, he kind of dives into the craft of how these stories come about. And he's always someone who is going to try and get as many answers as he can before just writing about something he doesn't know about.
Yeah, and I think this is one of his most honest representations of an author because he's, similar to most of King's characters, he's troubled and he has addiction issues and his personal life is a disaster. But just looking at the character of Mort Rainey just as a writer struggling with writer's block and just the things that he goes through, he doesn't become like a supernatural force like Jack Torrance, or he doesn't become like a vampire hunting superhero like Ben Mears does in Salem's Lot. Like it's just a really pretty grounded and down to earth representation of a guy that was a successful writer and now is suffering massive depression and is really trying to figure out a way to just kind of get past that. And like you said, it is about mental health and obviously some pretty extreme mental health towards the end. But the beginning of it really is just this guy who is depressed. He can't sleep anywhere but the couch and he's just, forcing bags of Doritos down his throat by the fistful. So it's, I think, at least as far as the film representation of the character of Mort Rainey goes, I think it's one of the most honest uh, author characters to come out of the King universe.
And while some moments can be funny, it's very much a serious matter because you have things that happen within the story that, even though I know how the story ends and I know he has a split personality, you see certain things like the dead dog, and you're just like, oh my goodness, that is so brutal. And the fact that Mort can't remember that he's the one who did that, that is something that is just terrifying at its core, because then you don't really know what Mort is capable of, and Mort doesn't know either.
Yeah, the movie does a really, really good job of. John Shooter is a real, physical, actual, active presence, and it's not until the end of the movie, which I don't want to jump to, but it's not until the end that you start to realize that we're watching this movie through Mort's perspective. So we're not seeing the things that he's doing that he doesn't remember because he's actively blocking them from his memory. So of course we're not going to see those things. So yeah, like it's absolutely horrifying and terrifying when when Chico gets killed. And yeah, trigger warning for the does the dog die in the movie? Because the cast is so small and the movie is so small that right out the gate you go, oh my god, Mort's dog was killed, and like that, it escalates the stakes so quickly.
Yeah, and you're left in the dark, one, if you haven't read the story, and two, if you haven't seen the movie before. So it's a movie that I think hits really, really hard the first time you watch it. If you watch it at an age where you can actually understand what's going on, which I don't think I did. So I think the second time I watched it, it hit a little harder. And even just going back to it, you're like, oh, wow, he actually did a lot with this story that maybe I didn't realize before. And sure, maybe there are a couple things changed from the story, but I think David Koepp really did a nice job with adapting this and visualizing it on the big screen.
It's typical like man in a cabin in the woods, like small scale story. And Kep's direction and the cinematography in the movie do such a good job of, for the first three quarters of the film, presenting this very small kind of confined space, where you think you can see everything, right? And that's the presentation we're given through Mort's perspective, is that we can very clearly see what's going on. John Shooter shows up, he harasses Mort, he kills Mort's dog, and it seems like a relatively simple story. And I think that that's where it succeeds so successfully, is in just that very simple presentation. Nothing's trying to be bigger than it is. It's just Mort versus John Shooter until the twist at the end.
Yeah, I want to talk a little about just the scenery that we get with this story, because it's a cabin in the woods kind of thing, but it doesn't really feel super woodsy. It's sort of just like this town in the mountains. It feels like a vacation place, and Mort is not the only person there, but he'll drive into town and he'll see all of the regulars. It's not tourist season by any means, and I think it gives you this sense of isolation because it feels like he's the only one out at the cabin at the time.
Yeah, it strikes this good balance of like he's out on his own living on the lake, but it's like you're just close enough to town for these people to not be helpful. It's like if he yelled loud enough, they might hear him, but they're not going to like come running to help him. As we see with like the typical useless small town sheriff. So it's a good balance is struck in the setting.
And you have a useless small town sheriff because what really goes on there? Not a whole lot from the looks of it. It's just kind of like everyone does their thing. You have, your it's like part diner, part hardware store. I can't really tell what it is,
I
but
know.
it's very small town vibes that you're getting when Mort goes into town, because it's like you have these places that are like a 2-in-1, stop shop, or you have the little teeny tiny post office and the tiny sheriff's office.
Yeah, I was trying to decide when he goes to the store and like, would I rather be the person who's shopping where people are eating, or would I rather be the person who's eating where people are shopping? It's like such a small, cramped. There's like one checkout stand and like four aisles of apparently everything. It's very strange, but also like perfectly small town, isolated area like that.
And there's obviously another town nearby because at some point the sheriff is like, you need to go to the other town.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He gets banned from Tashmere Lake, I think is where he lives technically, and then yeah, you can go shop somewhere else because we don't want to see you anymore. It's like the most casual like banning or like shunning of a person. But that, I mean, that's like very end. But that's a really well done scene, I think, too. The actor who plays the sheriff like plays those two sides of the character really well.
Yeah, and you can tell he's just kind of like, all right, we need to get this guy out of here. So he does his best sheriff impression that he can because you can tell he doesn't really want to be doing this, but he's like, well, they technically pay me to do this. So I'm just going to go tell him that he has to go elsewhere and he needs to stop like scaring the people in town or making them feel uncomfortable. And because that isolates him even more. We never see him go to that other town, from what I can tell. Every time we see him again after that, it's either at the cabin or he's interacting with other characters in a different location. For example, when his old house burns down.
Yeah, you get this really cool visual juxtaposition of Mort's house isolated on a lake, and then like the only other place he goes, like you said, is when he goes to, I think it's supposed to be New York City. So it's this like in a cabin by yourself with some trees, and then you're fighting with your ex-wife and an insurance investigator in like a crazy looking boardroom in a giant tower in a giant city. And it's just kind of really, it just creates this really interesting dichotomy of environments, and kind of plays off of like what's going on with Mort internally too, because he's like so caught up with wanting to be done and alone and by himself, but also still like fighting his divorce and stuff too.
I really enjoy that New York scene though, because you have Mort, Amy, and Ted just keeps following Amy everywhere. And you can tell that he doesn't trust Mort, but really, Mort just wants Ted to stay out of it because it really is none of Ted's business who gets what, or, what they had together when he and Amy were still together.
I love Mort's sass in those scenes. So like I want to reach through the screen and punch Ted so bad. He's like answering the fire chief's questions at the ruins of their house, and then he's like insisting on being part of the investigation of the insurance claims. And it's like, oh man, like he tries to play this like, I didn't do anything wrong. Sure, I slept with your wife and now I'm trying to steal your life out from under you, but I didn't do anything wrong. And you're like, oh my god, like every time Mort says something sassy back to him, I like was just like, I wanted to cheer. I loved it so much.
Yeah. I think what this movie does that makes me come back to it every now and then is just that it gives you this intense thriller without having to have a ton of action to it. And it does it in about an hour and 35 minutes.
Yeah, it's quick, it's simple, it's streamlined, and like you said, it doesn't rely on gimmicks or thrill. I mean, it's weird. It's a thriller, but it's not relying on like cheap thrills or anything. It's building suspense, it's building suspicion, and you're really rooting for Mort throughout this whole movie, which makes even the non-thriller esque interactions, like his interactions with Ted, like it still just makes them fulfilling.
Johnny Depp plays the character really, really well too, because he's not being completely maniacal. It's not like he is realizing he's doing these things. So that allows him to play the character a little differently than someone like Jack Nicholson playing Jack Torrance.
Every time I watch this movie, it reminds me of like an Edgar Allan Poe story, because it's just this very simple person that is, I mean, the monster of the movie is essentially his depression and his paranoia and his guilt, like he plagiarized way early in his career, and however many years later and how much success later, it obviously still bothers him and is manifesting inside of him, along with his grief and his depression and his divorce and all of that stuff. And it's like the internal demons are the literal demons of the movie.
Oh, absolutely. And it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to, even though maybe what they go through isn't as extreme as what Mort goes through.
Yeah, it's definitely like watching it now, being a little bit older and kind of a little more clued in with like my own like my own struggles with depression and like watching it and going, oh, yeah, this is actually a really great representation of like what going through this kind of stuff looks like. Like he's not moping around and laying in bed all day. Like he's trying to put his life back together and struggling with that, which is kind of exactly what I think a lot of people could watch this movie and see a lot of their own struggle in Mort up to a point before he starts killing people. Um, because he is just like struggling to put his life back together, and he is the obstacle he's got to overcome to be able to do that. And then ultimately he fails rather extraordinarily. But it's just a very simple and honest representation of grief and of depression. I keep coming back to that, but like I was really struck by that while watching it this time. It had never really hit me like that before.
There's sort of something to pick up on every time you watch this, almost, I feel like. And I think it's because a lot of it is so subtle.
Yeah, it is. I was watching it and knowing the ending, I was very deliberately watching to try to pick up on like, are there clues? Did they put clues as to what's actually going on? And they didn't, because Mort doesn't know what's happening. So there's not going to be clues, right? Like the filmmakers aren't winking at us to be like, "Oh, did you pick up on that? Did you figure it out yet?" Because Mort doesn't know what is happening. He's blacking it out. So it's blacked out from our view too, which is it's great. I personally think that it's like really 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 brilliantly done. There could have been little hints and Easter eggs and things about like, "Oh, look, John Shooter's not real." And that's not there, and you really are just buying into the story that Mort is telling you, and it's not until the ending that you realize that's not the reality of the situation.
Right. And I know you mentioned the ending a little earlier, but I do want to touch on that quite a bit here because I think the end is not only something that is revealed to Mort, but the first time you watch it, it's a complete revelation to you. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I put this together until the second time I watched it faster because I was like, okay, this guy is saying that his story was plagiarized, but the dates don't line up for when the stories were published. So it makes you believe there's actually a real person out there who is like, hey, I wrote this too. You changed the ending, but I'm going to come after you until, you prove to me that you wrote it first.
I love how it's done because if it's no like you, the first time I saw it and having not remembered the story, I didn't pick up on the fact that John Shooter wasn't real. And you could, if you sat somebody down for the first time to watch it and said, "Hey, watch this movie," and they just take it at face value, they're not going to see it coming either. But what's great about the way that it's done is that if you sit down and go, "Hey, when you watch this movie, the John Shooter character is not real," you can watch it and you can kind of piece it together. And there's not really hints throughout the movie, but you do kind of start to notice that, like, okay, every time he can't sleep, something bad happens. And he starts to get that nervous tick with his jaw as things start to escalate more. So, like, going back at it, you can kind of see it, but it's still not like obvious. It's not beating you over the head with it. It's not leading little breadcrumb trails for you to follow.
Yeah, and I like it better when movies do that because I don't really care for things as much when you can predict how it's going to end. And because I hadn't read the story before watching this movie for the first time, obviously I had that advantage. It's different if you read the story first and then watch this, of course, but there are plenty of people out there who might not ever pick up a Stephen King book, but they'll watch a bunch of his movies, either knowingly or unknowingly, depending on which ones they're watching.
Yeah, I think the best, I mean, obviously the best Stephen King adaptations, I think, are the ones that you can enjoy without knowing they're Stephen King adaptations, this being one of them. And you don't need to know the story, and it behooves you not to know what's going to happen, obviously. So I do like how John Shooter makes a point very early about how this whole story is about the ending. He pretty much tells you that up front. It's about the ending. The ending's the most important part. And I love that because Stephen King famously, as you are more aware than most, has kind of a problem putting endings together. So here we're presented with a story that's almost entirely about the ending. And then I think and I may not be in the majority here, but I think that the ending really comes together in this, and I think it's great.
I think it works really well. And even though I knew it was coming this time around, I was like, yeah, that's a pretty satisfying ending, even though it's still kind of left open ended, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, Mort's fate is certainly not determined, but the story of Shooter and Amy and Ted has obviously come to a close for sure. The movie is like definitely like a thriller. It's like psychological thriller the whole way through, like up until the ending. Then the ending, it like cranks the terror up a lot. Like once Amy shows up at the cabin, it just becomes this whole like she shows up and she's pulling the curtain back on everything, and we're kind of seeing what the reality of the situation actually was the whole time, and we realize that we've been seeing all of this through Mort's perspective and how nothing he's presented us has been reality. And the movie goes in my watching of it, like the movie goes from thriller to horror very, very quickly in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, with the ending, granted, we both think it was a pretty satisfying ending. Is there anything specific about it that you thought made it work so well in comparison to a lot of his other endings in particular?
I think the ending is, you know, he says it's the most important part of the story. I think it's the best part of this story. We know fairly early on that like Mort used to have a drinking problem and he used to smoke, and he doesn't do that anymore. And what immediately is setting him apart from other King protagonists is that he's beaten these addictions, right? Like he's conquered these problems. So throughout the movie, we never see Mort drink because he doesn't drink. And we never see him smoke except that one point that he lights up that one old cigarette, and like Shooter immediately shows up and attacks him. And they have their most violent encounter. And it's almost like his addictions are like literally fighting back at him. But we never see him really fall into those until Amy shows up and she finds the empty bottle of whiskey. And then you go, oh, well, Mort totally relapsed, but because this has all been from his perspective, he repressed the fact that he relapsed and hid that from us. And she's going through the cabin, and he's been living in squalor when we've been presented with this idea that he's actually been keeping it together. And that's the complete opposite of what has actually happened. He's trashed his house and everything's a mess. And she finds the cigarettes and the whiskey, and she's unveiling what has actually been happening to us. And we're seeing Mort through somebody else's perspective for the first time in the story. And then it very suddenly goes from this thriller where you're concerned for Mort's safety and the legitimacy of his claim to, oh my God, now I'm terrified for Amy. And she starts walking up that staircase, and it's just the dread. Like every step is dread. And what I think makes it work so well is that it's a shift in perspective without you really even being aware of the fact that you're shifting perspective in the storytelling.
Right. And that perspective change, it hits so hard, so fast, and you're just like, oh my goodness, we suddenly realize all of these things. And maybe that's the point where you kind of start piecing things together. And even though you can start piecing them together, you still don't entirely know how it's going to end. And the thing with adaptations is sometimes they'll change things from the book or the story to where maybe the movie doesn't end the same way as the story. But in this case, you're just like, oh, Mort's in trouble no matter what the ending is.
Right. It's wild because in an instant, like even before Amy shows up, we see what I think is a wonderfully visualized version of Mort talking to himself and him trying to walk away from himself, and then him having his breakdown. And they literally put on screen showing us Mort killing people, killing Ken and killing Greenlee, and burning down his own house. And even through that, you're still kind of rooting for Mort. And then the moment Amy shows up and that perspective shifts, and you go, holy crap, I've been rooting for the bad guy this entire time. It's just like, just totally blows everything away. And all of a sudden, it's not a thriller about Mort. It's a horror movie where Mort is now the killer. And you get that amazing reveal of him when he opens the door and he's behind the door and he's got the hat on. And it's just such a great visual where he's written shooter all over the house. And even then, like you said, you still don't like, maybe Amy's going to get through to him. Maybe she's going to be okay. Maybe we're going to get out of this alive. And it's really up until like the literal last second that you kind of are still rooting for a pseudo happy ending.
Plus, you have the fact that you don't really know how long Mort has been deceiving us. Was he really okay at the beginning and then spiraled somewhere along the way? Because when you see how many times Shooter is carved into the wood in that house in various ways, you're like, this must have taken hours.
Right. Like, did he carve Shooter every time he turned into Shooter? And then you're like, okay, well, let's say the movie takes place over a couple of days, because we know Shooter gives him the 3-day warning at one point. But then you get to the very end of the movie and you think back to the beginning, you're like, he wrote that manuscript at some point, though. So, like, at some point, he was Shooter often enough or long enough to pen an entire manuscript. And then you really realize, like, oh my God, how. And then you think back, okay, well, maybe Mort completely fell apart at the very, very beginning of the movie when he walked in on Amy and Ted. And we've been lied to literally the entire time.
It's so wild when you process all of this, how much they were able to accomplish. And, I said earlier it's not my favorite adaptation, but it's by far not even remotely close to the worst that I've seen. And I have
I,
seen quite a few at this point.
I think it's definitely one of the most successful. And for me, it's kind of like, this is the standard for what I want to see from Stephen King adaptations. Like, stop trying to adapt The Stand and It. Oh, like, they're 10 million pages long. It's not going to happen. Give me more apt pupils and 1408s and secret windows. Like, let's focus, because
But no more Bryan Singer.
no more Bryan Singer, please. Yeah. I don't know that it's my favorite, but I definitely think it's one of the most successful.
It's also one that has a bigger budget than a lot of quite a few of the other either TV movies, TV miniseries, or even some of the smaller theatrical releases, because the budget for this was 40 million. And you have to imagine a good chunk went to Johnny Depp, just given his level of fame. And it earned 92.9 million at the box office. So that's a pretty good showing for something that's quote unquote a horror movie.
Yeah, it came out in March in 2004. Like, there was nothing in theaters. So I think that turnaround, like, they had to consider that kind of a success.
Mm-hmm.
And like, they rushed it out because Pirates of the Caribbean came out. So they wanted to like ride on the coattails of that. But like, yeah, I had the same thought. I saw the budget at 40 million and I was like, well, I wonder how much of that was Johnny Depp's salary for the movie. Because there's like 10 people in the movie, including extras and 3 sets. So production really couldn't have been that much.
Yeah. Well, Mike, do you have anything else you want to say about the movie? I know you were pretty excited when this one was available, and I was like, all right, Secret Window, all yours.
Yeah, I really like it. And it's got really low Rotten Tomatoes and really low Metacritic and all of that. But if you haven't seen it, I genuinely suggest that you watch it if you like thrillers. It's definitely less like in your face horror than a lot of King adaptations are. It's very, like I said, Poe or Hitchcockian almost. And if you have watched it, maybe watch it again and just kind of like think about what's actually happening and like what you're being shown on screen versus what's actually happening that you're not seeing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Mike, do you have anything you want to plug to before we go here?
Yeah, the only thing I've got that I'm doing right now, if you're on Instagram and check out home video horror with underscores in between all the words, I'm just kind of curating like this fun little nostalgic, like, remember what it was like to look at all these horror video VHSs and kind of celebrating key art from like the 70s and 80s and 90s for horror movies. But other than that, no, I don't really have anything else going on right now.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Secret Window today. It has been a pleasure to talk about this one since it is one I've seen, I want to say 3 or 4 times at this point, which I'm not a person who is big on rewatching things all that often. It just so happened that this was like the random one I've seen multiple times.
Yeah, I'm really really happy to get to come on and talk about this, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Of course. And you might be back on the podcast in the future. I know the schedule is a little up in the air right now, as I had a lot of people who were interested all at the same time. So either that or you'll be on my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom, at some point. So people can look forward to that.
Yeah, I'm going to preemptively say yes to every invitation you're about to throw my way. So.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.